So this is the masthead of William Lloyd Garrison's original abolitionist newspaper, but it's colorized because it's the Liberator dot today. Walter Brueggemann asked the question, what is the normal habitat of hope? From where does hope emerge? I like the use of his word habitat, a word we often associate with wildlife conservation. The World Wildlife Fund says that habitat loss is likely the greatest threat to the variety of life on this planet today. It is identified as a main threat to 85% of all species, described in the IUCN's Red List. If hope is an endangered species, perhaps that's because we haven't attended sufficiently to its habitat. My name is Lowell Bliss. Welcome to episode 16 of the Liberator Today's video series on hope. We are looking at Brueggemann's Living Toward a Vision, Grief in the Midst of Technique, which is reprinted in the 1987 book Hope Within History. What is the normal habitat of hope, he asks. Or to make it personal, he also asks who keeps the present open to new interventions from God, and in what contexts. The hope tradition in ancient Israel suggests this answer, Brueggemann says. Hope emerges among those who publicly articulate and process their grief over their suffering. Hope, according to Brueggemann, emerges from sufferers who articulate their grief, sufferers who articulate and process their grief, sufferers who publicly articulate and process their grief. Brueggemann admits that this answer is an oddity. Quote, "It is a fact of experience that violates all of our reasonable expectations. We would not expect hope to emerge especially and particularly among the ones who suffer," unquote. But before he develops this odd answer, he wants to identify three places where hope is unlikely to appear with any power. In other words, what is the habitat where you are unlikely to spot hope, even if you were looking for it? First, quote, hope does not appear among the managers of the status quo. They might be optimists by nature, but people excessively committed to present power arrangements and present canons of knowledge tend not to wait expectantly for the newness of God. In the Old Testament, the managers of the status quo are the kings and the priests, and they are often juxtaposed to the prophets. Secondly, quote, hope does not appear among the intellectuals who reflect on systems categories and expect nothing new from God. This group includes statespersons, advisors, consultants, and what we might call today media pundits. According to Brueggemann, their task is to reflect on how things work, to make things work for their patrons. They work in a closed, managed system. The book of Ecclesiastes concludes, there is nothing new under the sun, no ground for hope. Thirdly, quote, hope does not appear among the oppressed, silent sufferers. This argument is literally an argument from silence. That is, the people in bondage are so beaten down that they cannot utter a word. They cannot speak their hurt, unquote. Brueggemann explains, that is why every totalitarian regime controls the media to keep others silent, stops the artists, and forbids assembly. To summarize, hope is not likely to come, then, among royal managers, among hired intellectuals, or among the muted oppressed. Instead, who hopes? Those who enter their grief and suffering and oppression, who brings it to speech, who publicly process it and move through it and beyond it. They are the ones who are surprised to find time again and again that hope and new social possibility come in the midst of such grief. He cross-references Romans 5:3, which reads, we can rejoice too when we run into problems and trials, for we know that they help us develop endurance. The governing example of biblical hope, according to Brueggemann, is the Exodus narrative. The Israelites were forced to make bricks for Pharaoh. Quote, "In the face of Pharaoh, this people groaned. They cried out, they protested, they raged. They brought their common misery to public speech, which must have been an incredibly dangerous thing to do. Such common misery brought to public speech is a force in history that neither the tyrannical Pharaoh nor the great God above can ignore." Unquote. And this from Exodus 2. "Years passed, and the king of Egypt died, but the Israelites continued to groan under their burden of slavery. They cried out for help, and their cry rose up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He looked down on the people of Israel and knew it was time to act." Brueggemann writes, "Out of that model event and that modeling narrative, we may extrapolate to our own time. The serious new hope for blacks, women, and the handicapped in our time has come from pain expressed. Indeed, if there is no grief brought to voice, there will be only status quo, only hopelessness, only invisibility, and therefore docility." Unquote. Brueggemann wrote this back in 1987 and has since included other categories besides blacks, women, and the handicapped, of those who are publicly articulating and processing their grief over their suffering. He also gives thought to those who don't have a voice to publicly articulate their pain. And here we come back to our introduction with its oblique references to wildlife conservation and biodiversity loss. Those of us who can read and speak out the words of Genesis chapter 1 should be mindful that the Creator God gave the blessing to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth to the animal kingdom. 5 verses, and depending on your cosmology, 1 whole day before he ever gave the same blessing to Homo sapiens and the same stewardship and a voice to speak for the voiceless. I'm Lowell Bliss, environmental missionary and climate activist. Thank you for visiting the Liberator today.